Hey, Shakeout Podcast listeners. I know it's been a while since we've last spoke. If you've been a lifetime listener to our podcast, or even if this is your first episode, we have some very, very exciting news for you. Canadian Running has brought on a new host of the program, someone that has been a runner since their youth and has given themselves the opportunity to compete at almost every level, including representing Canada on the world stage. Finding a host for the podcast can be difficult, and when the previous host, David Stoll, left to pursue his dream in men's fashion, we knew he'd be a tough guy to replace. Our previous hosts, Kate Van Buskirk and David Stoll, both built the Shakeout Podcast to what it is today, and us here at Canadian Running felt we wanted a host who had the knowledge and experience plus the personality to go along with it. With that, I want to happily introduce you to our new host of Canadian Running's The Shakeout Podcast, three-time NAIA champion, 2021 Canadian cross-country champion, and 2020 Tokyo Olympic finalist in the men's 3,000 meter steeplechase, Mona's very own, Gay.
Thanks so much for having me on, Marley. Really excited to take on this new chapter with Canadian Running and bring the Shakeout Podcast back to all of you, our listeners.
John, we're absolutely amped to have you as the new host. I mean, I'm probably speaking for not only everyone at Canadian Running, but all of the listeners as well. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about yourself? I know everyone has a kind of a different journey into running, but yours is a little bit different. I mean, you came into the sport from downhill skiing, correct?
Yeah, amongst other things. I think the best way to start is to say that I was a bit of a late bloomer, a bit of a late adopter into the sport of track and field. It wasn't something that I started competing in until halfway through high school. My grade 11 year was the first year I started running on the track. You know, from then on out, it was really love at first stride, and I've been so deeply indebted to the sport ever since. It's provided so much opportunity for me, and when I got the opportunity to take this on, it was something I jumped at because I've always been a huge fan of the Canadian running scene, and the opportunity to chat with phenomenal athletes and hear the stories of what's going on in the running world and share those stories with an even broader audience through the podcast medium is something that really, really excites me. And I think just provides a beautiful dovetail to what's going on in the rest of my career. I'm still running professionally, still chasing the dream, but very, very excited to be sharing other people's stories as well now through the Shakeout.
You said the word jumping there, which is kind of ironic as a steeplechaser. You know, for those that don't know the steeplechase, it's one of the most unique events sort of on the track, as it's, you know, the only one that you're jumping over water while trying to navigate barriers each lap. How did you get into steeplechase? I never really had the opportunity at high school meets, in my area at least, but how did you get into it?
You know, I think for most steeplechasers, certainly the ones that I've spoken with, the steeplechase tends to choose you. I was fortunate enough to have a high school club coach who was comfortable coaching the steeplechase, which many aren't for good reason. I understand why. It's a daunting thing to throw gangly teenagers towards those 36-inch barriers because they definitely don't bend. But I suppose she saw something in me that suggested either a tenacity or maybe a stubbornness that would suit myself well to the steeplechase. And I had some great teammates in my club system that were running the event already. And so my first experience with the event was solely to fill a starting line. There was another athlete that was looking to make a world junior team, and in order for the race to count, they had to have a minimum of 3 athletes on the starting line, and at the time of the race there was only 2, and so I got tapped on the shoulder to hack it, and didn't really matter if I finished a lap behind or not, but they just needed that third body on the line. And so I came in as the ringer, I suppose, and I took a big dive into the water pit on the second lap, and that didn't deter me enough to leave the event right then and there. Maybe it was against my better judgment to do so. I ended up finishing that race soaking wet, but totally enamored with it and for more, and haven't really looked back since.
Where did you end up in your first steeplechase race out of the 3?
Well, I was third, so on the podium, but when I tell people about the result, I try and leave out the fact that there was only 3 of us.
Oh, well, still, I mean, it's an incredible feat. You grew up in Kelowna, you moved to Vancouver, and now live in the running hub of Flagstaff, Arizona. All 3 are unbelievable running cities if you've never been. Which one is your favorite?
Oh, man, that's, I think, an impossible question to answer. Certainly an impossible question to answer without offending at least some of our listeners. You know, what makes all of them special is they have really vibrant running communities, and I certainly felt that from the moment that I started running competitively in Kelowna. We had a wonderful club system through the Okanagan Athletics Club. There's some great athletes for me to look up to, some still competing to this day, like Melindy Elmore, 3-time Canadian Olympian, and everything from the 1500 to the marathon. And so I really got a taste early on of what the running community could look like. And that was something that was really intoxicating to me, just being surrounded by people who had this shared passion for a sport that I derived so much personal joy from. And the same thing was true in Vancouver to almost a exponentially larger scale, bigger city, a bigger hub. I spent my university years there. That's where I met my wife through the track and field team at UBC, where some of my very best friends to this day first came into my life. And all of that just contributed to a real sense of belonging. And I feel in some ways that Flagstaff is the continuation of that. Like you mentioned, it really is a runner's mecca. And being here and just surrounding yourself with the excellence that is the professional running world here in Flagstaff is super inspiring. It definitely gets you out the door every morning hungry to be your best and to do your best. And it just allows you to tap into all of these very unique stories and meet people from so many different parts of the world, different event groups, different backgrounds, but all pursuing that same shared passion, that same desire to see where their limits are. And that's something that still gets me excited to get up every morning and head out the door and train, is figuring out where my limits are. And there's no better place to test your limits, in my opinion, than at 7,000 feet. So tough to pick between any of those three. They're all wonderful for different reasons. I'm certainly happy where I am now in Flagstaff, but the longer I spend here, the more I wax nostalgic about that sweet, sweet West Coast air, especially on cold, dry days up here in the middle of the winter.
Oh yeah, I know. It's there's something about the air around Vancouver or on Jericho Beach or Stanley Park that just hits different, you know.
It's special. You step off the plane and you feel like you're floating above the ground. So something that is not lost on me, especially moving away. Distance does make the heart grow fonder.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I imagine in Flagstaff as well. I mean, you're probably going out the door and seeing people you've once raced against or athletes you've looked up to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the coolest things about Flagstaff is even though there's so many different people who are competitors with one another, there is this shared recognition that we're better together and a real community feel. You'll run with anybody, you'll work out with anybody, and if they're pushing you, then you're pushing them back, and hopefully all of the boats in the harbor rise. That's been, I think, the most special part about being here is just every day you afford yourself the opportunity to be surrounded by excellence, and that's how you get the most out of yourself as an athlete.
No, for sure. Well, there's been a lot of change in your life over the past 6 months, including as well changing a little bit of race distances and trying out a half marathon for the first time. And rumor has it you might be taking on another distance in 2025.
Yeah, I think at this point it's probably the worst kept secret in Canadian running that I'm eyeing the roads. I think I've maybe brashly talked a big game about the potential I saw in myself to move up in distance, and I certainly got humbled, very much so, in my first experience with the half marathon a couple weeks ago in Houston. We won't delve too far into that. It was that humbling of an experience, but I am hungry to test myself at longer distances. I think I've always approached the sport from that heavier mileage side of things, and especially living in a city like Flagstaff, where excellence in the marathon is almost a given amongst so many athletes here. It really makes me excited to test myself and to learn a new distance, to learn all of the ins and outs that go with training for the half and the full marathon. The steeple is always going to have a soft spot in my heart, and I am incredibly grateful for the years that I was afforded the opportunity to race the steeple at a high level. But I do feel the tug of the road scene calling to me, and so this next year I hope will be a really exciting one and very much a year of transition, both in living circumstance, moving up here to Flagstaff, and in training distance, training surface, but all with that same goal of really trying to see where my limits are and get the most out of this sport that I possibly can.
I know you said you didn't want to delve into the half marathon too much, but I must ask, as you know, someone who stepped up to the half distance a few years ago from the track and, you know, went through the highs and lows of it. What was something that I feel like all runners kind of sort of have this experience, what's something that you kind of learned from the half or that you were shocked that you learned along the way?
I think just the fact that it keeps going. You know, an hour of competing feels like a long time when you're used to 8 minutes. You almost expect going in that you'll find an opportunity to settle and you'll have time to think. But from my experience, if you're racing it well, which I don't think I can say that I was in the last instance that I ran one, you really are just locked in for that whole hour. And so trying to keep yourself on that red line is exceedingly difficult and something that I think is going to take a lot of practice for me to get comfortable with. That comfort being uncomfortable is something that there's no substitute for actually going out and racing more to learn. And I think that was the biggest shock to my system, was knowing that I had to start hurting early and the hurt wasn't going to stop for an hour plus. And there's something really exciting about that. It draws you back in, you finish and you're in a world of pain, but an hour later you're already itching to get back out there and try again. And so that's something I'm really excited about. Really just the novelty of moving up in distance, trying a new event. It almost feels like those first early days in the steeplechase where every time I raced, I felt like I was learning something new and growing as an athlete and hungry to get back and try what I've learned in a new race setting.
Yeah, I guess with the steeplechase, it is kind of a different event because you need to be thinking all the time, right? You have telling your mind and your body to either jump or hurdle, especially too if you're coming over the water jump. There's 5 to 10 athletes around you landing where you are too, so you have to kind of keep your head on a swivel. Where in the half marathon or marathon, it's just kind of turning your mind off.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've always been a thinker on the track, and I think oftentimes that's been overthinking. And the steeple is an event where sometimes overthinking is good because, like you mentioned, there is so much going on. You have the barriers in the water, and there's comparatively a lot more hustle and bustle and movement compared to other distances. And as you mentioned, the road scene is completely different, where you really do want to be able to just get stuck into a pace, get stuck into a group, and turn your mind off for as long as possible. I think that is something that will take practice for me to learn, is allowing myself to go into that cruise control where you're in discomfort, absolutely, but you're not processing that discomfort. You're not reminding yourself of how much you're hurting. You're just simply embracing it and trying to let the pain wash over you and keep on pushing through. So again, really excited in a almost masochistic way to learn that more.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's John. It's so funny how we sort of came in touch. I was watching your play-by-play call actually on the U Sports Championships last fall, and I was out running with a few friends the next day that were like, "Hey, are you guys still looking for a podcast host?" And I said, "Oh yeah." And then they were like, "Oh, did you watch U Sports?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then they were like, "Yeah, didn't you think John Gay was great at the announcing, the play-by-play? He was so knowledgeable about the in-race tactics and broadcasting of it." My running group in Toronto applauds you for that. I think after that I reached out to you and we spoke at Nationals about this whole opportunity about coming together. What kind of excited you about becoming a podcast host?
I think to start with doing that broadcast, you uncovered a secret that I suppose is not too big of a secret for anybody that knows me, but once you get me talking, it's difficult to get me to stop, and particularly when you're talking about running, I could go forever. And so being given the opportunity to get in front of a mic and have a captive audience that I can share my passion for the sport with is something that has always excited me. And I think the medium of a podcast, particularly one with the history and the legacy of the Shakeout Podcast, just seemed like it was such a perfect fit to hopefully share some of my expertise. I don't know it all, but I've been around the sport long enough that I think I've picked up some things here and there along the way, as well as just to go deeper into the storytelling around the sport. When you've been in it as long as I have, you realize there are so many incredible stories, whether that's at the elite end of the sport, whether that's at the recreational end, all of the multifaceted ways that running impacts people's lives are something that I've always been fascinated by. And I think having the opportunity each week to bring someone onto the show, to hear their story, to ask questions that I've had burning a hole in my head for years was really exciting. And to be able to do that in a medium where I can then share it with other people who probably have the same questions as I have or have the same areas of interest, want to hear those stories, want to hear about Canadians in the running world and what they're doing to make a mark, all just seemed like such a perfect opportunity and really the nexus of everything that I'm passionate about in the sport. And I am a big believer that community is what we make of it, and I really hope that in my small way this can be a way to build into that Canadian running community that's already so strong but continuing to grow. There's such huge appetite to hear more about this sport that we all love, and I hope that I can help stoke that appetite even more and share some of the stories that maybe otherwise would go unheard.
No, yeah, John, I think that's a great point. No matter if you're finishing at the front of the pack or the back of the pack, everyone has a story of how they got into running. And I think that's what makes the running community so cool, right? Is that everyone has a different why of why they do it. So to get that out and hear their story, I think that's going to be amazing. What are some topics or episodes that listeners can look forward to?
Yeah, great question. I'm really hopeful with this podcast to be able to share stories, like you mentioned, from the front of the field to the back of the field and everything supplementary to that as well. I think so much of the richness and depth of the running community comes not just from the athletes, but from coaches, from trainers, from psychologists, from nutritionists, all of the people that are working on the periphery of the athletes that we see on the starting line, but that have such a deep connection to the sport in such oftentimes very selfless ways. And I'm really excited to be able to share that whole breadth of stories. I come at the sport myself, as you know, from the high performance side, and there will certainly be content for those track and field nerds like myself who want the details, they want the splits, they want to hear about what's going on at the sharp end of the spear. But I got into the sport as a recreational runner myself, and that was where I first really saw the tremendous capacity that the sport of running has to connect people, to be a driver of community. And I'm super excited to share those stories as well. So you can expect to hear some great stories from masters age athletes setting age group records or run streakers. You're also going to hear stories that touch on the nutrition side of things, maybe answering those questions that people were too afraid to ask about fueling or race day preparation, as well as highlighting some of the stories of the tremendous Canadian athletes that we have. I think we are really in a golden age of athletics here in Canada. We have so much talent at the international level that is worth highlighting, worth celebrating, and I'm looking forward to sharing those stories as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks, John. When can our listeners expect new episodes?
Yeah, they should be setting their schedules Thursday morning every week. You can expect a new episode of the Shakeout Podcast to be coming out. Again, we're going to try and give you a great diversity of listening experiences, touching on all sides of the sport, and I'm super excited to get going. Super excited to have the support of Canadian Running behind this podcast, to be bringing it back to you. Very grateful to David and to Kate for setting such a high standard, which I will do my absolute best to uphold. And looking forward to connecting with you, our listeners, as well. We're doing this to be a part of the Canadian running community, and we're always intensely interested in what you have to say, what questions or stories you want told on the podcast. So excited to get going, looking forward to this weekly journey with each of you, and can't wait to start sharing episodes in the coming weeks.
Well, John, I'll speak on behalf of all listeners here. Everyone is so excited to have you as the new host. Every Thursday, tune into the Shakeout Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll keep you updated on all the Canadian running news.
Looking forward to getting into it.
Thanks, John.